Thank you, everyone, for joining another one of our monthly webinar series. Our focus today is going to be on OpenAir invoicing tips and best practices. We've done a variation of this webinar way back in 2014, so there's some features that have come along since then, and we're going to highlight really a lot of functional features that will hopefully remove some workarounds that you're doing or things that you didn't know the system could do that's going to just make your life much easier in general. So the webinar marketing email that came out highlighted that we're going to talk about billing, invoice number increments, expense groups, expense insert layouts, billing codes, but there's so much more that is possible to cover in this topic. Our last webinar was an hour long, so I tried to cut it down, and I hope I'm not going too fast. If you guys want a copy of these slides afterwards, please email us at info@topstepconsulting.com or put the request into our website. We'll certainly give you the slide deck so that you can remember everything that I'm about to go through here. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first topic on the agenda was the invoice numbering. So let me just talk about what invoice numbering is. It has to be a unique number, just like most accounting systems have to have a unique number for invoicing. So of course, when you're creating an invoice in OpenAir, it does do incremental invoice numbers, and you can always manually change those, but you can't have two of the exact same number. That sort of violates the concept of an invoice number being unique. However, there are occasions where companies need to have more than one sequential numbering system. Everyone can't use 1, 2, 3 because then Germany's grabbing 4 and Canada's grabbing 7 and North America's grabbing 10, and everyone can't figure out which ones are their invoices very easily. When I get this question, I do have to highlight there are two options actually to change invoice numbering to have what's called a prefix. And when there's a prefix involved with invoice numbering, then you get a unique number sequence by prefix. And there's two standard features. One is an invoice prefix per customer, and another one is more at the project level. So of course, there's always variations of when you need what. So let's talk about the invoice prefix per customer. So if you haven't played around with the customer records too much in OpenAir, let me remind you, there's actually 3 parts to a customer record. There's, of course, the demographic information. There's contacts that you can link to them, and then there's the billing information tab. And there's a lot of sort of hidden stuff here that people don't necessarily see all the time. And in this hidden area is the invoice prefix field. If you notice, it's I highlight it on the screen here. And that invoice prefix can be anything. Typically, we recommend things like maybe a geography or maybe a department code or something with a dash. And therefore, anything after the dash would be the number that OpenAir assigns to it. So you can imagine if you have a set of customers in North America, you could put NA dash, and then every invoice generated against one of those customers would be in sequential order with the prefix of NA. Okay. A customer can only have one prefix. So what this tends to drive is that if you have ATOS origin, Germany ATOS origin, UK ATOS origin, North America, you end up having basically 3 of those customers so that you can each have your own customer and your own invoice prefix so that you could control the invoicing sequencing, of course, if you want to go this direction at the customer level. Right? But if you'd rather not go that direction, there's a second feature. It's a switch, and it requires a special custom field to be set up. It's available also in Suite Answers. And what it does is it gives you the ability to set up a 3-character prefix that you can set on a project form, on the project properties form. It has to be 3 characters. It can't be 1, can't be 5, can't be 2. It has to be 3. And what happens is you generate your invoices like normal, and it gets a regular OpenAir invoice number, 1, 2, 3, 4, sequential, whatever. But then when you have them all approved, then you use this run in action feature in the invoices module. So you select all the invoices that you want to flip to reflect the prefix that is reflected on the projects for those invoices. And when you run the action, you'll see this option that says apply incremented invoice numbers. And what that provides is that it makes sure that all the holes are filled in with the sequence, and it converts the number from whatever number it was to the three-character prefix with a dash, and then the sequential number after that. Okay. The only challenge with this is that if you don't set a prefix on the project and you accidentally apply the incremented invoice number, it gets a prefix of ZZZ. That's never looks that great. Or if you try to set up like two-character, because it's a custom field that holds it and it's a drop-down. And of course, the drop-downs are not going to make you put 3 characters in. So if for some reason you put 4 or 2, you're going to get the ZZZ again. So there's a little bit of a setup, a little bit of a watch out type thing on this, but it is a very nice feature because then you can control it at the project level. And now you don't have to have duplicate customers. You can actually have more of a project control there. So if you didn't know about those, hopefully those will help you out. The next thing on the agenda was basically layouts, information about invoice layouts. Now the invoice layouts continue to be enhanced. Every release, there's something else going on with the invoice layouts or the controls for invoicing. And so this feature came out a while ago, but it's an alternate invoice layout. What happens is when you bring up the invoice layout, you'll see invoice columns as options of what columns do you put in the body of the invoice. Right below that, if you have this switch turned on, it is an internal switch, you will see another drop-down that says invoice layout for expense items. And what it allows you to do is put an inset into your invoice layout of another layout that will be applied to only expense items. Okay, purchase items do not have their own layout, so it's just for expense items. But they try very hard when you do that alternate invoice layout. They try very hard to line everything up so it still looks very nice and neat. As you can see the examples on the right-hand side. In the screenshot here, you see the name of the expense item, the date, and the total. But above it in the labor, I have like type and date and user and hours, and it's trying to line things up so it's as clean as possible with the auto formatting in OpenAir. So the expense alternate layout is nice. The only caution I give folks is that it's easy to kind of slam another invoice layout in there and not quite get what you want. I like naming conventions so that you know, hey, this is an alternate layout for expenses. So you start it with the words FMT, so you know it's a formatting thing, not necessarily a standalone invoice layout, for example. And along those same lines, there are things called expense groupings. So some of you have expense items that are very nice and clean. They have maybe 10, 12 items, mileage, lodging, airfare, business meals, and so forth. And I've worked with other companies that have a much more robust, broken down, detailed layout with, breakfast with a colleague, lunch, entertainment lunch, dinner, snack, just all the different layouts which all roll up into business meals. So if you don't want to show that level of detail on an invoice, you just want to simply categorize it as travel or meals or transportation in the example here on the screen. In the invoice layout itself, there's something called custom expense item groups. It's available. It's not. You turn on the switch, and it'll be available on all your layouts. And what you do is you basically give a group a name. So in the example on the screen, it says transportation. And then you identify what expense item types belong to that group. An expense item type can only be in one group, so there's a little bit of a kind of thinking game here on how you want things to be formatted. But the group is per invoice layout, so you can change it up on different invoice layouts. And what happens is then when you go to put the expenses on your invoice, instead of the expense item itself, you get the name of the group. So you can see in the example on the right, here's an example of an invoice where I'm showing all of the transportation, airfare, car rental, ground transit, train, taxi, Uber, whatever you want to put in there. It's all like, how did I get from A to B? And that's all grouped under transportation. And that makes your invoices much cleaner, and it doesn't necessarily expose your whole, expense GL account to the customers that you're sending your invoices to. You can kind of make them a little bit more cleaner. Now, going along with the expense theme here that I'm talking about, one thing I do want to highlight is a few releases ago, I can't remember when, but there was an enhancement to the invoice layout that allows you to pass receipts directly from expense reports on the receipt level. They have to be attached on the receipt level. So if you rebill that receipt on a customer invoice, the attached copy of the scanned receipt, however, mobile app, whatever, can be pulled through automatically to the invoice. And there's two options here. One is when a customer looks at the invoice online, they can click on a link that says associated attachments, and it'll pop up a window that says, here's all the attachments, and it'll be all the attachments from the receipts that are on that invoice. An alternate item is that if they download a PDF, and the reason I'm highlighting this is that later on there's a PDF enhancement that came in April of this year that I love. The include attached download file when generating a PDF, that will also include all of the receipts in PDF form as well, so that you get sort of the full package along the way. So I definitely, if you are using expense reports and you are having people scan receipts to the system and you are doing invoicing to your customers, this is a great way of sort of saving your invoicers a lot of time, because then the receipts can just pass right on through with the layout. But it's controlled inside the layout, the invoice layout. Now, one topic that it comes up occasionally when I'm talking with customers about how to handle prepayments, and the concept is retainers. So when somebody gives you, sort of an upfront billing for the year, so you're charging $50,000, and as you burn it off, you'll show them how things are used. There's a couple ways to do that. One is to invoice them and then send them $0 invoices where the rate is $0 until you use up all the money, for example. But the other option is basically to say, okay, you gave us the money, so I'm going to create what's called a retainer. And this is a tab that you'll see in the invoice module. If you don't see it, then there's a switch you need to turn on, and it's an internal switch. But what you'll do is you can actually just create this retainer and say, hey, the customer gave me $50,000. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate the invoice, show them the actual rates that they would pay if they were paying after the fact. But then I'm going to draw down from that retainer, so I have a continual balance report to show them to say, hey, this invoice is $7,500, but I'm going to draw that from your retainer that you've already given me, and now the balance of that retainer is $42,500. Okay. So the retainer is a nice feature if you want to go down the path of giving the customer the actual invoice and the rates that they would see and the work that's been done, but then basically let them know, but you already gave us the money, so you owe us nothing, right? So they see all the detail there, okay? Now, the challenge with the retainer is kind of like a customer PO. It's related to the customer. And so many of us have multiple projects per customer. So when you're dealing with a retainer, you may have a retainer that's going to pay for this type of service, but not that type of service. So you set up two different projects, but now you have to keep track of which retainer, like which invoice to draw the retainer from and which invoice to send to the customer that they have to pay. Might be different departments, for example. If you have that situation, there is another feature that came out a number of years ago where you can link a retainer to a customer PO. And if you're familiar with customer POs, they are also customer-based, but you link them to a project. So therefore, the customer PO can drive the funding for a project, and therefore the retainer would only be available to be used on invoices that are with that project, with that customer PO. So there is a way to do that alignment, but in case you're concerned about that, but it is a little bit different to use. Retainers are a little bit different to use because they are at the customer level. Now, other things that come into place when you're dealing with invoicing is OpenAir has a lot of standard terminology, and many of us know about the terminology overrides that we have in the system where you can rename bookings to be allocations or schedulings or assignments or whatever you want to do. Invoices actually have a similar thing, and it's per layout. So this is how OpenAir can actually meet some requirements where you need to put a different language on the invoice, like not English. You need to use Spanish or French or Japanese or whatever you need the formatting of the invoice to look like. There's a feature called invoice terminology, and what it allows you to do is rename all the standard terms that are used and displayed on the invoice, including the headers and everything like that. And when you have that, you can change a layout to use different terminology. So this gives you the ability to be very global in your invoicing, so you're not restricted to a certain type just because you like that format. you can make multiple copies of the same invoice, but then change the language that you want. So it's in Spanish and French and so forth. Okay, I highly recommend this to customers, even though you may not think you need it. It is interesting the number of times that people don't like the term user on an invoice. They want to say employee or resource or something like that, but it's user is standard, and people want to rename that. Other things that are formatting items, and this is something that it's very subtle in the system, but it's the invoice header itself. And there's a lot of options in the invoice header that people aren't aware of. That, you just sort of create the invoice and it has about 3 or 4 things standard in the header, and you're like, it's good enough, and go. But every now and then there's a challenge that we get where customers are like, we want the invoice to have, the header to have all of this information or none of this information, or whatever. So in the invoice layout itself, the invoice header has the ability to do things like suppressing the terms, so you don't see net 30 in the header, or show when it's due based on the terms. Net 30 from today would be December 14th, 13th, I don't know. Or suppressing the project name. This was especially important if you have multiple projects on your invoice. But if you don't want the invoice header to have the project name, you just want it to be in the content of the invoice, or maybe not at all, you can actually suppress the project name here. And there's also a way to add custom fields into the header. This is a trick that some of us will use when we're trying to keep track of which ones we have to send through FedEx and which ones we have to, we can email, or which ones we have to send to through a portal system, or just information that you have on the project, like a reference number from a customer that they always wanted to reference contract number XYZ. And so therefore you can put that in a custom field on the project and then display that in the header. And those custom fields come from the client customer record and the project record, if you want. So these are just standard. They're in everyone's layout. But if you don't see these exact checkboxes, then you may have this alternate invoice header, which allows you to customize the content of the invoice header with substitutable terms. So you'll notice here I don't have that, hide the terms or show the due date, but I do have suppress the project name, and I still have the invoice header custom fields. But I also now have this header template. And what it shows here is basically, I think, how it comes when you turn on a feature, but it gives you a little bit of an HTML option, and you have to learn the database terms on how to use the terminology override or the terminology data, so that it can substitute those things between the percent signs and be able to replace the information that you formatted in the template with the actual invoice of what's coming in from the project and the client. So it is very nice. You can actually customize it a little bit more exactly how you want the header to be. So certainly let us know if you would like more help with this, but this is a switch as well to turn it on so you have more control on the header. And finally, there's actually a custom header feature that some customers have, or I get questions about when you're actually creating the invoice. So, hey, when I go to create the invoice, we always have a standard sentence that says, thank you for your business. Here are your fees for the month of blah, blah, blah. And as we all know, there's an invoicing notes field available on the project form. There's an invoicing notes field available on the invoice. But when you're generating hundreds of invoices, you don't want to open each one up and type a nice special message inside the invoice note. So this feature came out way back, I think back in 2007, I think, this custom header feature 8. And it's a switch. You turn on the switch, and what happens is when you go to create multiple invoices at the same time, you get the option to check the box to say, apply this custom header to all of these invoices, which means it gives the standard message on the invoice right before the body of the invoice. And you can see how it also has those substitutable values. And you see how it says that word start and end in the double percent sign items. It's going to pull the date that's in the date range that you're putting in for the multiple invoices. So this feature only applies when you're sort of creating invoices in batch. But of course, you can create one invoice using this feature too. It's not a problem. So that saves a lot of time because it sort of sticks the standard message in there, and you can write whatever you want in the message. But of course, the big feature is that it'll pull the start and end date in case you want to put like a date range on your invoice. Okay, now back to the last item that was on the agenda. So I deviated from the agenda a little bit, but I'm back to the item that we had on there called billing code. So I like to term things as old school. This I think is an old school feature. It's a pretty cool feature, but it's not necessarily something that everyone needs or wants to use. This feature allows you to self-define a 2-character set or 1 character. It's up to you, but the maximum is 2, and it's a little field that shows up on the project form. Most customers hide it because they don't use it, they don't need to use it, or they don't know what it is, so they just clean up the form and hide it. But what billing code is a way for you to tag a project. And then when you go to run your billing rules with the pending billing report, or create invoices with the multi-invoice layout, or even run reports, honestly, like regular reports, you can say only pull projects that have billing code M for monthly, because I'm running my monthly invoices, or D for daily, or A for annual. So it's up to you. So there's examples here on the screen, but it allows you to identify a set of projects without having to create a custom field that has to be set. There's a lot of filtering options now with the pending billing report that weren't available back in the day. So the pending billing itself basically doesn't necessarily have to rely on this too much. But when you're doing the multi-invoice create, now this becomes something that's a little bit more usable when you're dealing with international customers, where you're dealing with international projects, and Latin America wants to pull only their invoices and generate only their invoices. So they could use a billing code to sort of segregate and suck out all of the charges from those projects, so that you're only creating Latin America invoices at one time. So it's a nifty little feature. So you'll see it. It's called billing code. It's got 2 digits. I think it's over by the budget money field on the project properties page. Now here's the and more part of the agenda. So I thought I would dive into the customer PO agreement functionality a little bit more. So automatically, when you start using customer POs and agreements, those will display in the invoice header. But there is a switch where you can turn it off. So it's called do not show the customer PO on the invoice header. Nice name. But you can also then show it on the invoice layout, the body of it, as one of the fields or columns or groupings, so that you can still show it visibly. And this is really helpful, I think, for invoices where you're supporting multiple customer POs on the same invoice. So you want to have a clean, here's how much this one is, here's how much that one is, okay? The other thing about the customer PO and agreements is that when you do that multiple invoice creation, as you can see, there's a lot of functionality with that multi-invoice creation action. You can actually split invoices by customer PO. So if you have 2 customer POs on a project, maybe you kind of lump things together, but you really need to generate 2 invoices. So you can just check the box that says split it by customer PO, and it'll generate multiple invoices by PO. And there's a trick that I learned from a customer, which was fabulous. And what they did is they basically used the agreement functionality, and they would create fake agreements in the system, well, real ones, but then they weren't really using agreement functionality. They were only using it to tag it on expense items. So expense billing rules, they would put the agreement on the expense billing rule. All the charges would have a tag of that agreement. And then when they would go create their invoices with the multi-invoice creation option, they would split by agreement, and then all their expenses went on one invoice, and all of their time and fixed fee and stuff went on a different invoice automatically. So they didn't have to kind of pick and choose things. So it's a really nifty time saver. And the one feature that I like and we use here at TopStep is basically a customer PO balance display. So it's a switch that you turn on. So when you're generating your invoices, it will show you just by looking at the invoices. And here we renamed it sales orders, but it's the same concept. You can see what the funding amount was for the PO and how much is left based on looking at this invoice. So it's a really handy feature to kind of check yourself and make sure that you're keeping within budget. Now, some odd switches that is occasionally a requirement that I'm like, yep, there's a switch for that. And here's a couple of ones in case you've run into this. There's a way that when you're creating an invoice, and this only applies to individual invoice creation, not the multi-invoice batch process. But when you're selecting a bunch of charges or a charge, you can split the charges. You can split a charge and have part of it move into a different stage, or you can use a percentage split, the prorate charge. This was something that was kind of big when it was, hey, this project's worth $50,000. I'm going to prorate the first like 50% of it now and 50% of it later type thing. So you split the single charge into two pieces for two invoices, which of course you can do with billing rules, but obviously flexibility, the billing rules are not necessarily what everyone wants to do. They want to have a control more at the invoicing side of it. So these switches allow you to use a splitting option at the time of invoice creation. And emailing. So many of you may know that you can email the invoices out of OpenAir to customers. In the April release, a fabulous enhancement was sent out, which allows you to now automatically attach a PDF copy of the invoice that you're emailing. Okay, this has been a long time ask from many of you. So if you're not aware of it, please look down farther before you hit the send button and check the box. It's automatically turned on for everyone. It says include PDF invoice as attachment. My only caution here is that, remember, you've sent them a PDF. So if you also send them the link and you change the format or something from the link online, then your PDF, of course, does not change. So, you might have a little bit of a mismatch. And so people will tend to open the attachment versus going back to the link when you start sending PDFs. The other thing is to be able to CC somebody automatically and even BCC somebody automatically, specifically just for invoices. So now as a billing team, you can make sure a copy of the email gets sent into a distribution, maybe inbox for reference, or you're CCing an alternate recipient of the invoice. So nice features here, and those CC and BCC defaults, because you can override them per invoice, of course. Those are found in the invoice options under the administration application settings area. Now, another thing that this is one of those things that came up recently. I was talking to someone, I said, you know what, there's an easy way to do that. When you send an invoice out through an email, there's usually a nice message you want to have, a nice standard message that you want to have. So you actually can put, this is also a very old feature, but under global settings, there's something called invoice email settings. You can type your nice message here, and every time you send an email, it pulls the content of this into the email automatically. And of course, the link is included then as well into the email. And then on the customer billing information tab, again, odd features there, but there's an override. So if you need to change the message for different customers to be like a different language or a different intent or whatever, you can override that per customer. So it'll pull from the customer first. If there's nothing from the customer, then it pulls from this default area. And therefore, you don't have to type a standard message or cut and paste a standard message into your email, so you're emailing to the customers. Okay. And because it can send invoices out, I want to highlight where you can find information about what did I do with the invoice and what's overdue. So one is the history tab on the invoice in OpenAir. When you create it, when you email it, when the customer opens it, when you record payment, all of that is logged as historical events on every invoice. So you can see that at at any point of who you emailed it to, who did it in your company, and when the customer opened it. So that's a really handy reference tool if you're not aware of it. And of course, there is an accounts receivable report, or aged receivables, many of you may know it as, that you can run to say which is overdue and have the different buckets, just like any accounting system. So this is as close as OpenAir can come to an accounting system, but it does do everything related to the invoices. Right? And because we all want to make sure that we're on top of collections, we have come up with a way to automate your collection reminders. So there is an invoice reminder script that we have developed. Quite a few of you have implemented it, or we have customers that have implemented it. So if you are interested, you can please contact us. We'll let you know how it works. It gives you the option to set up so that messages are automatically emailed to customers as reminders that their invoices are still outstanding for payment. And of course, since it's a script, we have controls over the different conditions that would trigger those type of emails to save you guys some time. Okay. So in summary, this was a very quick run through of some features that I think some of you may already know, but I hope at least one feature is something that you weren't aware of and think it may be helpful. Invoices are your customer-facing document. It's your continual touch point with the customer, and you want to make them nice and clean and succinct so that you get that collection and that turnaround. But you also want to save your finance people some time so they can really focus on bigger and better things, right? So saving time and automating, but making things clean to the customer is really our goal to help you. And you can use as many layouts as you need to. Naming conventions are king so that you can keep track of which ones do what. But I hope something in this invoice tips and tricks kind of hit home for you and you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the support in all the webinars that we've been doing over the years, and we hope to see you in December.